Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexandra. I'm a professional fashion designer, pattern cutter and creative consultant, and your friendly fashion cheerleader here at Digital Pattern Library, here to cheer you along, help you build your dream wardrobe, and I'm there every step of the way, teaching the entire fashion process from design through to construction. Over in the DPL Atelier, which is my high value, low cost fashion membership, my members and I are currently working through a skirt framework. Our create, cut, construct framework cycle is a 3-month experience where month 1 we do fashion design, month 2 we do pattern cutting, and month 3 we do sewing and construction. Now we are just about to enter month 3 with our original ideas, and I thought a good little touch point for this video would be teaching you the basics, which is seam construction. So I'm going to be teaching you 4 really, did you just hear that squeak? That's my trainers. I never wear trainers in my studio. So I'm going to be teaching you 4 seam variations today, but as the designer, you can technically invent your own seam. You can do your own finishes. You can just sample, experiment and have fun with it. That is the beauty of fashion and being a fashion designer. But I'm going to talk you through 4 easy seams to do. Do not let the fact that some of these are enclosed seams overwhelm you. Anything I teach today can also be applied to a curve. You just want to take your time and press, press, press. So let's jump into it with the most basic, the most friendly, an open seam, also called a plain seam. Really bloody annoying that in fashion you have multiple different names that pretty much mean the same thing. So I'm going to be doing these samples on some scrap calico. I quite like cutting my calico samples into A4 pieces. This means that I can put them into something called a fashion file. Again, I've got plenty of videos available on YouTube explaining what a fashion file is. It's such a useful resource, I can never pronounce that, to help you with your learning so that you can refer back to skills and techniques on your journey. So I always cut my calico samples into roughly A4 sizes so that I can store them accordingly in a nice neat folder. So I'm going to just start with scrap calico here. Another thing I have available inside the DPL Atelier or to purchase as a standalone masterclass is working with various textiles. Now you may use a different seam for a different textile. So a French seam, for example, would be really suited to a nice lightweight fabric. But the first thing I'm going to do is sew my open seam. Now your seam allowance can be anything you so wish. If you're more comfortable, if you're perhaps a beginner and you're more comfortable with a wider seam allowance, then working with 1.5 centimeters or a 1/4 inch might be something to suit you. Whereas for me, a standard seam allowance is about 1 centimeter for a plain seam. So to do a plain seam is just 1 line of stitching. I'm going to raise my foot here, put my material underneath, and I'm going to lower my needle into the work before I start anything. I'm going to change my stitch length to 2.5 millimeters. This is just in terms of working with the calico. The longer the stitch length, I would be using a longer stitch length for a thicker fabric or for a stretch fabric, and the shorter the stitch length I would be using for a lightweight fabric or a netting or something like that. So to do an open seam, I'm just going to determine what my seam allowance is. For me here it's going to be 1 centimeter, and if I knock my sewing machine on, that would be helpful. I'm just going to start with my needle in my work. I'm going to do a couple of tacks forward, 1, 2, and back, 1, 2. That's a back tack. That secures your stitching so that it doesn't come undone. And then I'm just going to continue that line of stitching. One, 2, and I'm going to do the same at the end once I've done with it, and then just snip that off. Now, if you saw my previous video about helping you with straight lines of stitching, I had some really easy beginner-friendly tips and techniques to help you get a better quality sewing result. So for an open seam, this is all you need to do, and then you can take it over to the iron and you can press that open. This would be, depending on your design result, this would be right side to right side, your fabric, and then you'd be stitching your line. so that when you open it up, this is the wrong side of your garment, unless you wanted this to be a design detail. Perhaps you did a bias bound finish on the edge, maybe you did want to overlock it, but you go back and have a look at my other videos as to why I don't agree with overlocking wovens. Not that there's anything technically wrong with it, it's just for a high-end finish we don't often overlock wovens. If you want to find out why, go and have a look at that previous video. So as a standard, as tradition, you would be doing right sides together. Sew your line of stitching, and then this, once pressed, is the right side of your garment, this is the wrong side of your garment. As the designer, you can choose to do that the reverse if you so wish. For my plain and open seam then, with my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and again, if you feel more comfortable to do so as a beginner, you can absolutely sew this as a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, as a 2 centimetre seam allowance, as a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance. But what I then want to do is just open this up, which is why it's called an open seam / a plain seam, blah, blah, blah. And I just want to press that open with the iron. And now this is going to be the wrong side, or the inside of my garment. You may want to finish the edge of this because this will ultimately fray. And this is going to be the right side of my garment. To do a French seam then, you want about 1.5 centimetres seam allowance as a minimum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrong sides together, put my fabric, line that up, and I'm going to sew another 1 centimetre seam allowance. So this is now wrong sides together. I'm going to pop my needle in my work, I'm going to sew what looks like an open seam. Like so, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to trim away my seam allowance excess here. I'm going to trim it down to 2 if not 3 millimeters, but take care not to snip through your actual stitching. The closer you can get it, the neater your French seam will look. And I'm just going to remove that excess. Again, we have some amazing scrap buster patterns if you want to be able to do stuff with this and have a more sustainable approach to your projects. And then at the machine, I'm going to then put it right sides together. So I'm going to fold this over, put that right side together, and I'm going to press that. What I'm actually going to do is roll that seam between my fingers so that it's right to the edge. And I really want to get that as neat as possible before pressing that at the iron. So here is my French seam. I've trimmed that away. So this is the right side of my fabric, whether that's a pattern or whatever you've determined to be the right side. I'm then going to fold this over. So now it is right sides facing. This, now that I folded over, would be the wrong side of your fabric. And I'm just going to press that. Making sure that the edge of my seam is right on the edge there. Again, if you want to see this in action, I have a YouTube video where I'm sewing up a blouse using luxury sewing techniques, and I use a French seam quite often in that. But this is where you want it. You don't want the edge of that seam, if you're pressing it, you don't want the edge of that seam to be further down. You want to make sure that you're getting it right on the almost fold line. So you don't want it to be down like this. You want to get that as crisp as possible right to the top of your work. And press like so. And then what you want to do at the machine is you just want to enclose that with a 0.5 centimetre line of stitching. And that'll make a really nice dainty French seam. Perfect for translucent fabrics because you'll be able to see through it slightly, and it'll be nice and pretty and enclosed on the inside as well as the outside. So back at the machine then, I'm just going to pop my foot up and put my needle in my work as before. I am doing this in a contrast colour thread just so that you can see clearly what I'm up to with these seam constructions. But of course you can do colour matched, or if you wanted it to be a design detail, you could pick any colour you so wish in contrast to your textile. And I'm going to go 1, 2, back 2, and then finish enclosing my seam. The narrower the seam with French seams, the more dainty and more professional it looks, but you have here a nice enclosed seam now. So this is actually the wrong side of your textile. And you're going to have this ridge, although it's all enclosed, there's going to be no fraying there at all. And this is now the right side, so the outside of your garment. And you can give that a press it towards the centre back or the side seams, however you want your garment to lie. And there we have a French seam. I really love this one. Just be conscious, because there is a ridge, what garment you're making, where this is going to be on the wearer. Is that going to be comfortable for undergarments? Do you want that ridge against your skin in certain areas? Is the textile soft enough to compensate for that? If you're doing quite a hard, rigid textile, just give thought to the final purpose of the garment so that this is both practical and professional, looking nice. Give that a little press over at the iron, and there we have it. There's your French seam. To do a flat felled seam, you are going to start with your textile wrong sides together. And I am going to sew a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance here. So this is going to be the largest so far. And I'm just going to, again, back tack as before. For a flat felled seam, I'm actually going to cut away just one of the seam allowance. So I'm going to trim away the excess on just one of them. See how I fold this up here? I'm going to leave one and I'm going to trim one. So how I like to do that is I actually flip my work over, and because when we're cutting, the best way to cut your fabric is to allow the table to take the weight of your scissors. That's going to give you a really accurate cut. I'm just going to flip that over and start snipping up the one edge like so. And again, put your scraps to one side. You can absolutely use these offcuts for stuffing or anything like that. It's a really sustainable approach. Now, if we look at the wrong side of our garment or our seam, we have this going on here. So we've got trimmed away the excess, and we've still got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance going on one side of the fabric. If I turn that around, you'll be able to see that. So here we've actually trimmed away the seam allowance on one side, and we still have the 1.5 seam allowance left over on the other. If we now take this over to the iron, I'm going to show you how to enclose this in a flat felled finish. With your flat felled seam then, I'm going to push this towards me. So with the seam allowance excess, I'm going to push that towards me. Just give it a quick press on the right side as well, making sure that everything is crisp and flat as I'm working through my project. It's a really good habit to get into, to press after every seam. Don't keep constructing your garment to the point where you can't actually get into the nooks and crannies. Once we're at this phase, I'm going to fold the seam allowance excess, the 1.5 centimetre, up to meet the stitch line and fold that in half. You can actually do this, depending what textile you're using, at the machine. When you're constructing denim and jeans, or denim wear with jeans, a traditional method is to actually hand roll a flat felled seam of the yoke at the sewing machine without actually pressing it. It gives a really nice soft rolled finish. But for this could be seen on the side seam of shirts, on the armhole of shirts. Again, don't be overwhelmed by the fact that we're basically sewing, trimming and sewing again. This can absolutely work on curved seams. Just take your time with pressing. And once you're at this point, having folded that, double folded that over, you then just want to edge stitch this down at the machine in place, just to enclose your seam and make sure that everything is secure and strong as possible. This is one of the strongest seams you can do for obvious reasons. You're enclosing it, you're double stitching it. It's really, really resilient. Perfect for stress points like inseams. So let's hop on over to the machine and sew that. And so again, I'm just going to raise my foot, put my needle in my work. Make sure I'm doing a couple of back tacks. And there we have a flat felled seam. It is your prerogative as the designer which way you want to be the right and wrong side. Again, this side is flat, so if you give consideration to the wearer, you may want that to be on the interior of the garment so that there's not a ridge running up against the skin. But the one side you can see 2 lines of stitching, and on the other you can just see the one. But press everything, have confidence at the iron, and this is a really good reinforced enclosed seam. This next seam is a welt seam, and while similar to a flat felled seam, I personally don't use this one too much, but you may use it should your material be a little bit too thick for a flat felled seam. We have a lot of folding with a flat felled seam. You might find this in sportswear, in leather garments, in denim garments. It's quite popular and common. You'll see it a lot with inseams. Anything that's bulky, you can really benefit from a welt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this right sides together. That is my chair moving on the floor, nothing untoward. Get your mind out the gutter. And I'm just going to sew this at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Again, starting with what looks like an open or plain seam. And I'm going to trim that away. And just like the flat felled seam, I'm going to trim away the allowance of one of the sides. So very similar to the previous seam that we've just done. And then another thing I want to do is finish the edge of this seam allowance here that is still exposed and still 1.5 centimeters. Now you can do that with an overlock stitch. You can do that in any seam finish you like, basically. I'm, for the purpose of this video, just going to use my pinking shears. There we go. Again, all scraps can be saved. There we go, I've just given that a really good press. Now from the right side, I'm going to stitch that down with a healthy seam allowance, about 1 centimeter. Again, the seam allowance, as the designer, can always change. You can decide how wide or how narrow you want to do it. This is just a general rule of thumb to get you started experimenting with these seam construction techniques, but you can absolutely play around with how wide or narrow, see if you like the finished result, add that and hack it on your patterns. So I'm just going to, as before, and unlike with a flat felled seam, why this is good for heavy fabrics is because we've not folded it under on itself. So it's just the one fold that we've done. So from the wrong side, this is now our welt seam with a nice finished edge. It's folded down and secured down, so there's not too much of a lip or anything catching there, but we've also not folded it under on itself like we do with the flat felled. So if you have a really heavyweight fabric, a welt seam may be better suited. You've still enclosed the seam underneath. This is still really, really durable. From the right side, we have that one line of stitching. Again, if you colour match that, disappeared. Again, if you colour match that with your thread, then obviously you wouldn't see this contrast black line of stitching. It would be colour matched to your textile. And then from the wrong side, we have the finished seam here that encloses the one underneath that we trimmed away. So there we have 4 seam types. And to accompany these, if you wanted to, have a little look at our collectible fashion file packs. Now, these are collectible PDF documents. Here is the SEAMS one that breaks down these kind of sewing techniques. And this is why I like to cut my calico samples to A4 size or letter size, wherever you are in the world, because I can just tuck them into a poly pocket and keep this stored in my sewing toolkit and pattern cutting toolkit. But our fashion file packs teach you a range of sewing and pattern cutting techniques. In total, bite-sized chunks. They are not expensive at all, and you can collect specific techniques and methods to suit your sewing projects. We've got all sorts in here, from pockets through to inserting zips, through to hacking patterns and dart manipulation. So this is why anytime I'm sampling, I always cut it to fit inside a poly pocket, and I can store these techniques in my stash to dip back into at a later date. Especially useful throughout your sewing journey. And there we have it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. This is literally at the start of a long, fun, creative journey into sewing and construction. I have other free resources available for you if you want to have a look at the start of a long, exciting journey into both pattern cutting and design. Why not head on over and take my Pattern Cutting Basics course? It is a free course with 3 mini training series. We've got scrap buster patterns if you want to sew up something using all your textile waste, save it from landfill and head on over, download any free pattern you like, and you can save that textile waste that otherwise ends up on your cutting room floor. And then of course we've got the 3-day design challenge. If you want to experiment with a little bit of designing original ideas that flatter your figure and to build your dream wardrobe, come on over and have a look at that as well. I'll link all 3 down below. If you haven't done so already, like and subscribe, and I will catch you on the flip side with some more fashion value.